It's a very great honor for me to be here at Korea University. Thank you, Professor Che, for your challenging introduction. This means I have to learn Korean, I think. And as you probably know, I don't know any words from Korean, but maybe I could read the Korean Silok and do something about Korean history. I'm also very grateful to Professor Oh. We have been friends for 33 years. And it's wonderful to come back to Korea and see him again. And as always, he has something very useful to say. So I'm now thinking that I have to change my research because of his comments at the beginning. And finally, I will thank a newer friend, Jo Yong-hun, who we met 5 years ago. And he very graciously invited me to come and speak to you today. Thank you. The talk I'm going to give you today is in some ways an extension of what appears in The Troubled Empire. In The Troubled Empire, I reproduce a map that was discovered just before I published the book, and I included the map in the book. And today is really a long footnote on the map that appears in the book that Professor Jo has translated. But I thought perhaps I should give you some background to my interest in the map before I actually talk to you about the map. I'm a historian of China, but China is not the limit of my interest. When I went to university, when I was the age of the students here, I actually studied English literature. I did not study Chinese history. And I favored the literature of the 17th century. And the pleasure of this topic is that, in fact, it brings me back, as you'll see in my talk today. My talk is partly about China, but it's mostly about the larger world in the 17th century, and it will take us eventually, at the end of my talk, it will take us to England in the 17th century. So the progress of the talk will, in some ways, I'm going backwards in my own biography from China back to England. So we begin in Oxford. I was teaching in Oxford in 2008. And a librarian there pulled out a map that the only thing that we knew about it was that it was a map of China, and he suggested that I should come and see it. So the story that I'm going to tell you today begins in Oxford when the map was discovered, and we will return to Oxford at the end of the talk. This is what the map looked like when it was found in the library. It's a very large map. The map is about as tall as this screen and almost as wide as the picture. So it's a very large wall map. And as you can see, it was in terrible condition. It had been rolled up. The paint was flaking. The paper was cracking. It was in terrible condition. And so it took 6 months for the restoration staff to restore the map to good condition. The librarian at the Bodleian Library in Oxford asked me, is it worth restoring this map? And I said, absolutely, because this map doesn't change Chinese history, but it deepens and enlarges Chinese history in some wonderfully surprising ways. The map was restored by Robert Minty on the left, who is the chief conservator of the Bodleian Library, and Keisuke Sugiyama, who is a Japanese paper restorer and the conservator of Japanese paintings at the British Museum. And together they spent, as I said, about half a year working on the map to relax the map and then to take the paper off the backing and to remount it on new Japanese paper. This is the map once it was restored. And I'm afraid the image is not very strong, but I think you can pretty quickly see what it is a map of. Here is a transcription of the map on the left showing you what is represented in the original map. So as you can see, this is China. You see the Great Wall as drawn across the top of China. There's Korea. There's a funny Japan, the Philippines, Vietnam, Laos, Southeast Asia, Sumatra and Java, and the island of Borneo. So you can see it there transcribed on the left. Now, you can see that the map is remarkably accurate. I had a geography student geo-reference the map, which is a process by which you correlate positions on a historical map with positions as we understand them today. And by sort of breaking the map apart a little bit, she was able to show that the correlation between this image of East Asia in 1608 and our image of East Asia today, it's pretty close. It's pretty good. But for me, this was not the end of the, this was the beginning, excuse me, this was the beginning of the problem. This was not the end of the problem. Because I could have said, oh, it's quite accurate, and therefore this is a good Chinese map, and that ends the story. But no, for me, the problem is, why does it look like this? Because it shouldn't look like this. In fact, the first time I saw the map, I thought perhaps it was a forgery. Because there is a big market for forged Chinese maps at the moment. Now, why did I think that? It's because this is how a map of China should look at the end of the Ming Dynasty. This is called the White Map. It was also in the Bodleian Library. It was deposited in 1684. It was given by Captain White, who worked for the East India Company. It's a printed map. It's a very long scroll. I've enlarged it a little bit, but it's a very long scroll, as high as the ceiling, going down to the floor. It's a pair of maps. One is a map of the heavens. The other one is a map of the earth. And this is the map of the earth. And it represents China as we expect it to appear. It's important to point out that while we think this is a map of China, and China occupies about 90% of the map, in fact, it is intended to be a map of the world. Because you have Korea here, you have, here's Japan, here's Okinawa, Vietnam, India. So it's in fact a map of the world. But when you, I have one other map. This is another map from this same period, from the late Ming Dynasty. Again, you see China. It's this big square mass with the Great Wall along the top. But you still have, you have Korea and you have Japan and, let's see, you have Thailand and what else do you have? Well, maybe, oh, no, you have India over here, the Kunlun Mountains. So it's a map of China in which China is the most important thing. So this is why the Selden map, as it is known, I'll explain the name later on. This is why the Selden map was so wrong to me, because this is how Chinese, it's not that the Chinese didn't see the rest of the world, but they drew it in a certain way. And so the Selden map did not conform at all to Chinese mapping conventions. So the question becomes, why did the map maker make it this way? And to explain his technique, I'm going to use this section of the map. So here it is blown up. It's the Taiwan Strait. Here's Taiwan. Let's see, Quanzhou, Zhangzhou. There's Guangdong, Canton, all the way up to, well, Zhejiang, the city of Hangzhou. So we're looking at the eastern coast of China with out to Taiwan and then the northern part of the Philippines. Okay, so yes, so this is, again, showing this map. I moved it over a little bit. As I looked over the map, I discovered that there were lines drawn all over the map. And I'll explain these lines in a moment. But the lines created a network that fills the whole South China Sea. But in the network, there is one dot. The dot is right there. And the dot is off either Quanzhou and Zhangzhou. It's difficult to say which is more important. But it is easy to say that the dot marks the point from which Chinese merchants sailed abroad to the rest of East Asia. What I want to focus on and what I was able to use to understand the map was this series of lines. So starting here at Quanzhou and Zhangzhou, going south past Guangdong, it goes all the way down, it goes to Hanoi and eventually goes all the way down to Singapore. The same set of lines go all the way up to Japan. So what does this mean? Well, to understand the characters, and this may be familiar to some of you, we have to go to the Chinese compass. Can I ask, are Koreans familiar with the characters used for the traditional compass, or is this unfamiliar to you? So there is a broad familiarity with reading the compass. All right, well, south is, of course, Wu, north is Zi, and there's a series of 24 characters in the compass. So when you correlate the compass with these two positions, you see that Gun and Yin are at this point of the compass, Shun and Kun are at this point, and that they are combined in those two readings along the coast. Each of these positions, if we convert it into the international system of degrees, this is 45 degrees, this is 60, 225 degrees, and 240 degrees, and that when they are combined, they mark these two positions 52.5 degrees and 232.5 degrees. So, why is this interesting? It's interesting because we are being given as an indication of where the accuracy of the map comes from. The cartographer, when he drew these lines, did his best to draw them on the magnetic angle that is indicated along the lines. So the network of maps is a kind of magnetic structure that was drawn to hold the map together. And because it's magnetically accurate, this, it seemed to me, was why the map was accurate. It was simply following, it was the kind of knowledge that a navigator needed to cross the water. So that was my supposition. And we got proof of this during the restoration process, because part of the process was to remove the map from the cloth backing to which it had been attached. And this is a photograph of Robert Minty and his assistants, Marinita Stiglitz, removing the cloth from the original map has been turned upside down, it's lying flat, and the cloth backing is being pulled off it. For the conservators, this was the most terrible moment in the entire process, because they were afraid that when they lifted the cloth off, the map would disintegrate into a million little pieces. But in fact, the paper quality was so good that when they took the backing off, the map stayed perfectly intact underneath. This is where the surprise then came, because after they took the backing off, they found there were marks on the back of the map. I won't show you all the marks, I'm just going to show you one particular set of marks, and it's a series of lines going diagonally across the back of the paper. Now, you probably already recognize these lines, because if we turn the map over, it's the same set of lines on the other side. The best I can guess from this is that the cartographer first drew a series of lines on the back of the map. Perhaps he was experimenting, perhaps he didn't quite like what he did, so after drawing those lines, he turned the paper over and he then drew them again on the other side. So, why is this important? Well, if we go back to the previous, to the back of the map, we don't see any landforms on this map. We only see lines. This has led me to conclude that he drew the map by drawing the lines first. And after he'd drawn the route lines across the oceans, then he filled in the land around the routes. So unlike, I think if I asked you all to draw a map of sailing routes in East Asia, you would draw the land masses, and then you would draw the lines connecting the ports. But he'd used the opposite order. He drew the lines first, and then he filled in the land masses. This is why I'm calling the talk Mapping from the Water, because he's working from the water to the land. So this then led me to ask, what does it mean to map from the water? Well, if we look at Chinese coastal maps of the 16th century, most of them are drawn like this map, which comes from the Chouhai Tubian, which was a large compilation of information about coastal defense produced in the 1560s. And the significant thing about the map, if you look at the design, is that the land is on the bottom and the water is on the top. That is, you are standing on the land and you are looking out into the water. So my research problem was, could I find maps that were drawn the other way, in which you stood at the water and looked at the land? And it turns out those maps also exist. I'm sorry the captions got blocked out here. You would be able to read that this map is taken from the Wu Bei Zhi. This is a compilation produced about 1621 in which the compiler has included maps from the Zheng He expeditions from the 15th century. So here in this map, we are out in the water looking towards the land, and this is the route that Zheng He's fleet took as it sailed down the Chinese coast. And in fact, we're on a similar place as the section I showed you in the Selden map, because you see here's Wenzhou Wei, Rui'an. These are sites along the coast of Zhejiang. These are not terrifically accurate maps, but they're reasonably accurate. There is an attempt to use the information that the Zheng He fleets used for sailing purposes to create not really a cartographically accurate map, but a record of where the ships sailed. I'll just show you two more from the Wu Bei Zhi of the Zheng He voyages. This is up the Strait of Malacca. Here's the Malaysian peninsula. This is the island of Sumatra. These are showing the routes of the ships into Malacca and out towards the Indian Ocean. And this is famously the last map in the series. It shows, this is the Indian Ocean, this is the west coast of India, showing routes that take you up to Saudi Arabia. Here is Aden on the south coast of Saudi Arabia, and then the coast of Africa down below, as showing the routes the ships took. So these are very evidently maps drawn from the water. Chinese sailors didn't get onto the land to draw what the routes looked like from the land. They were making their maps from ships. And so this is very much a water-based, thank you. This is very much a water-based view of travel in the Indian Ocean. Well, these are not real maps in the sense that if you wouldn't want to get in a boat and sail across the Indian Ocean with this as your map. So they're not there to get you anywhere. They are there to provide a record of where you traveled. Well, why did I think this might be interesting? It's because on the Selden map, over there on the left-hand side, there is a colophon. There is an inscription written on the map, which I have blown up here. I should tell you, first of all, that this colophon sits here beside a place called Guli, Guli Guo. Guli in Chinese is Calicut. So this is has become the west coast of India for the cartographer. This then is the inscription, which I've copied out. So you see that you get three route descriptions. The first one says from Calicut to Aden, so you're crossing the Sea of Arabia. You go northwest, and you travel 185 watches. The next one says from Calicut going to Jafar, also on the south coast of Saudi Arabia. You go northwest and you go 150 watches. And the third one is a much more complicated description of the route that gets you to Hormuz at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. So this information tells me that the cartographer had access to information from the Zheng He voyages, because his map ends basically at the end of the Strait of Malacca. He doesn't go into the Indian Ocean, but he's nonetheless included this information so that in the future, if some Chinese ship were to go into the Indian Ocean, you would have directions that would get you to Arabia. Nonetheless, we still have a problem of design. That is, he may have found information about the Zheng He voyages, but visually his map bears no relationship to the maps left over from the Zheng He trip. So to think about where he got his design from, I want to go back to the compass. And you'll see with the compass, there is also a ruler, which when I tried the ruler against the routes, I was able to determine that each tick of the ruler represented 24 hours travel by water. So then I have to start thinking comparatively. Where else have I seen compasses and rulers? Well, I will give you this map. It's by Piri, an Ottoman cartographer, and it's a map of the Atlantic Ocean. in which he has used 2 compasses and 2 rulers. Now, this is called a Portolan chart, and it's a chart that Europeans were making in the 15th, 16th, early 17th centuries. These were charts designed to help navigators sail across open water. I'm not an expert on Portolan charts, so it's a little difficult for me to explain how this was done, but the basic idea is that the cartographer would randomly choose 8 points in a circle. He would put a compass in each of those 8 points, and then he would draw either 8 or 16 lines radiating out from every one of these circles. So here you see 2 of the points. Well, actually, you've got a small point here too. You've got 3 of the points that Peary would have drawn to create his map of the Atlantic Ocean. At this point, what European cartographers did not have a set grid of latitude and longitude. They worked with these compasses. So, for example, if you want to draw this island, you triangulate. You've got one line coming from that compass. You've got one line coming from this compass, another one here, and then by triangulating, you're able to locate the island in the middle of the ocean. Here's another example. This is by Juan de la Cosa, a Spanish cartographer from the same period, from the 16th century. And you can see here compass rose here, there's one missing here, there's one here, one here, one here. And again, he uses these roses to create a network of lines within which he is able to draw the land. So it's a case of mapping from the water. So, did the Chinese map maker, was he copying European maps? And there's 2 answers to this question. The first answer is yes, simply because the idea of drawing a compass and a ruler on a map is completely unnatural in the Chinese mapping tradition. So he must have seen European Portolan charts. But that's the simple answer. The technical answer is no, because he used a completely different technique. He didn't use compasses to create a web of lines from which he could triangulate positions on his map. Instead, he used the compass and the ruler to draw routes on its line. So it's a completely different technique that happens, coincidentally, to use a compass and a ruler. So I'll take you back now to the georeferenced map. So the way he did the map using his ruler and compass was to draw in all the route lines that skirt all the land masses in East Asia. And then, as I said, he filled the land in around. The result is a map more accurate than any map a European could draw at this time. Let me add one more little technical detail. You'll notice when the map is georeferenced that my geography student had to pull the map apart so that it could fit into how the world actually looks. So what happened when he drew the map is that he made the South China Sea too small. And the only way we could make it fit the world was to pull it open again. Why did he make the South China Sea too small? Because of the curvature of the Earth. He couldn't make all his lines line up to true north because on a curved surface, the lines are always going away from each other. The world is not flat. The world is a curve. And so he had to sort of squeeze East Asia down to try and make his magnetic lines actually connect with each other. Now what I would like to do in the last section of my talk is talk about its reception. And for that, I need to tell you a little bit about the man who ended up owning the map, John Selden. And the question I have for myself and for us today is, why did John Selden end up owning this map? And I should say that when he died in 1654, he donated the map to the Bodleian Library at Oxford. And as was usual practice in those days, a major donation, your name was attached to the donation. So that's why it's called the Selden map. It's because he gave it to the Bodleian after he died. So what I had to do was figure out how did a lawyer in London get hold of this map. And so I constructed a number of steps for which I have indirect proof, not direct proof. The first step is I believe the map was confiscated by Captain John Serres of the East India Company in Bantam about the year 1608. Jakarta, of course, is the most important city in Java today, but it was Bantam was the main trading site until 1620, and it is then replaced by Jakarta. But it was the point from which all trade to and from Europe passed, and the English East India Company had a base there. So it's a place we don't know much about now, and usually when we describe the South China Sea, we focus on Malacca as the port through which ships traveled into the Indian Ocean. But this was the important point of contact for trade going to Europe. Now, John Serres went back to London in 1609, and my guess is that sometime between going back and leaving again, he left in 1613, I think, he probably sold it to Richard Hakluyt, who was the major collector and editor of travel accounts in the early 17th century in England. Now, after Hakluyt died, much of his collection was purchased by Samuel Purkis, who replaced him as the most important publisher of travelers' tales in the 1610s and 1620s. Now, it so happens that Samuel Purkis and John Selden were friends. In fact, John Selden wrote material for Purkis's publications, and Purkis was particularly interested in China. He publishes 2 maps of China. These are published about 1625. So these are the first images that English people have of what China looks like. What's interesting for us after you've seen the white map is that you see that Purkis's map of China, Purkis thought this was a much more accurate map of China than that one. And it's very like the traditional Chinese conception of the world seen from China's point of view. The map on the left he got from a Dutch publisher. It's also based on Chinese originals, but Purkis suspected that Europeans had made a mess of that map, and he was very proud of the fact that he included a real Chinese map. Now, nobody in England at this time knew any Chinese, so he left the title, Huang Ming Yi Tong Fang Yu Bei Lan. Yeah, and he didn't quite know how to read it, so he put the map of China in between all the Chinese characters. But unfortunately, he took off all the other Chinese, and the original of this map no longer survives. It's unfortunate. Now, Purkis did not include the Selden map in his book. That may be because, 1, he didn't have it, or 2, the map was just too big for him to reproduce in his book. At any rate, I have assumed that Purkis had the map. Purkis dies in 1626, and then John Selden acquires part of Purkis's library later on, and that, I think, is how he got the map. Now I need to just tell you a few things about John Selden. Here he is with the map. John Selden was probably the most important constitutional legal theorist in 17th century England. He was also England's first scholar of Oriental languages. He learned 5 Asian languages. Now, he didn't ever learn Chinese because nobody in England knew Chinese, but he collected all documents with Asian languages on them, which is part of the reason, I think, that he would have collected this map. But there's another element here, and that is he is the author of a work called Mare Clausum, The Closed Sea. In 1609, Huig de Groot, better known as Grotius, wrote a famous tract called The Free Sea, in which he argued that ships should be allowed to sail anywhere in the world without political limits. And John Selden's book, Mare Clausum, argued against Grotius and said, no, states can have jurisdiction on the water. Accordingly, I think John Selden would have been very interested to see a map of East Asia in relation to the question of what rights do states have over jurisdiction over the ocean. And there's one more element to add to this story, which is that John Selden was quite close to members of the East India Company, the Virginia Company, and the Muscovy Company. These are all state monopolies that were created to organize England's global trade. Grotius said that the seas were free and you could sail anywhere you want. He also said that you can declare war on states that refuse you access to their water. Selden's argument was, no, states have jurisdiction, and if you want to trade with indigenous states, you have to respect their legal requirements. And under that interest in global trade lies actually, for Selden, an even deeper commitment to the rule of law. He is elected to the Long Parliament of 1640. This is probably in his handwriting. It's a list of the demands that Parliament makes against Charles I. And the most important that I want to draw to you here is the sentence that says, "The king hath not power to lay any imposition upon foreign commodities without consent of Parliament," which is to say, the king has no right to tax foreign trade if Parliament has not given its permission. So, and I mention this because the rise of constitutional democracy in England in the 17th century is underpinned by the need for there to be a separation between the executive and the legislature of the state, and it's based on the right of merchants, the perceived right of merchants to be able to trade and to tax their own trade and not have a king tell them how much tax they have to pay. This is the foundation of English democracy, is based on this relationship between the East India Company and King Charles I. So this is why I think John Selden was interested in the map. It was part of evidence that he was acquiring for that reflected his sense of the importance of global trade in the 17th century. Now I've got just a couple of slides to finish off with to stress the importance of the effect of the effect of international trade. I go back to the painting by Johannes Vermeer that is on the cover of my book, Vermeer's Hat. You'll notice that there is a map hanging on the back wall, and that if you look carefully, the map is dotted with ships. It's just simply filled with ships, because now this is drawing from the land, but it's looking out to the water as the medium through which international trade is changing the European economy. And it's not just Europeans who think this way. Here's a map, a Chinese map of, there we go, of about 1743. Now, it looks like the old-fashioned cartography in which China takes up 90% of the world and the rest of the world is dotted around. But this map is already showing that global trade has changed China's perception of itself, because among other things, you now have an Atlantic Ocean and an Arctic Ocean that has appeared. And on top of that, you also have little ships dotting the coastline along the south. And I'm going to just finally show you this bowl, which I found in the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco. It's made in Zhangzhou about the time that the Selden map was made. And it's a wonderful hybrid of European and Chinese motifs. There's the Chinese compass in the middle, of course, but coming out of the Chinese compass are European lines, portolan lines. Now that compass and those lines don't fit together. But for the man who decorated this bowl, he thought, we're going to describe the maritime world. So I'll put in some European elements, I'll put in some Chinese elements, I'll mix them all together. So let me get back to the title of my talk, or the subtitle of my talk, Recentering World Trade in the 17th Century. I'm not sure that world trade yet had a center, but it had it's like if a wheel has a center, a kind of a central, a center that out of which spokes run, then I think if there was a center of world trade in this period, it's probably the South China Sea. So world trade is not centered on Europe. It's not centered on Peru, although the flow of silver, as Professor O has pointed out, was the financial instrument that allowed trade to happen very well. It's also not centered in China particularly, although China was producing commodities. It's centered here in this great empty mass of water around which Chinese, Japanese, Europeans, Thais, Malays, Vietnamese, Indians, and Africans were sailing at the beginning of the 17th century. I'm sorry to take so long. We've run very late, but thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
감사합니다. 이제 질문을 받겠습니다.
It was a great pleasure to give the lecture today at Korea University. I find that my lecture changes depending on the place that I give it. To talk about the Selden map in England is different from talking about it in Canada, and different again from talking about it in Korea, because I think everybody looks at the map from their place in the world. Now, as a Canadian, I'm not on the map. Koreans are, in a sense, on the Selden map, not really, but Korea is there. So Koreans take a particular interest in the map. And it's interesting for me then to respond to the kinds of questions that Korean students ask when I talk about this period in Chinese history.